Good morning. Welcome back to another day of Bible study. So glad to have you here with us as we continue on through the Whole50 Bible study, day 34 of 50 days that are designed to help you grow and transform spiritually in your life, to take you to a more whole and healthy place in your relationship with Jesus Christ. And it has been quite a journey. It's been quite a fun journey along the way at moments, but today's, I will admit, may be one of the funnest passages that we've had, at least in my opinion. But before we get there, just a couple of things to remind you of if you are watching this close to the air time of it. This coming Sunday, May 9th, we will be meeting in person together at Carlin Park here in South Florida in Jupiter at the Sea Oats Pavilion. Would love for you to join us there at, I was about to say 9, that's not the right time. It's on the 9th, but would love to meet you there at 11 o'clock a.m. as we gather together. I know that many of our snowbirds have gone home, and it's May and it's summer, and so lots of people are busy. Things are crazy. Traveling has happened, preparing for the end of school. But if you're around, we'd love to see you and have you come out and be a part of that. There will be food, so be sure to come hungry, because we're committed to providing food whenever we get together, just as they did in the early church. And in fact, foreshadowing, part of our passage today is going to explain why food is such a big deal in our gatherings, because it was a big deal in the early church gatherings. Another opportunity, if you're in Northeast Ohio, will be coming just a bit over a week from now. On May 16th, we'll be gathering up there in Willoughby. So if you're in the Cleveland area or in the Northeastern Ohio area, we would love to have you come out and be a part. Daniels Park in Willoughby will be at the East Pavilion in Daniels Park at 11 o'clock, and the intent is to have food there as well. We're still working out all the details on that, but we do have a time, we do have a location. I'm going to be there, and I can't wait to meet you there as well. It'll be something of a reunion for all of us Clevelanders who have been there for a long time. If you were a part of the church whenever we were up there, and if you aren't, or weren't, that's absolutely okay. We want to invite you to come and be a part of this as well, because there are lots of people who are part of Christ's Table who don't even remember a time where I lived in Cleveland. In fact, I barely remember a time I lived in Cleveland. We had young kids then, and those years are quite a blur. This Bible study is going out in the mail here in just a few days as well. This will be a follow-up study. A very wise and attention-oriented member of Christ's Table pointed out to me yesterday that I've been giving the wrong date for a while on the start date of this. I've been saying one date, but the real date is a week later. It's on May 24th. And so we will fully finish the Whole50 Bible study. And then the next day we will start up with this study, Party On. And so very much looking forward to that. They'll be going in the mail in a few days. If you'd like to get that and be a part of our next Bible study about food and feasts and fellowship in the Bible, then all you need to do is make a donation to Christ's Table. You can do that over at www.christtable.today. And if you financially can't swing that right now, that's absolutely okay. Just send me a message and I'll make sure that you get one for absolutely free. Now, on to today's Bible passage, which some of our people do these readings and Bible studies a day or two early, and so that they'll be ready, and some people do them a day or two late so that they can do it at their own leisure and not wait for me to post online. So somebody had read this passage and reached out to me from Christ's Table yesterday and said, I don't remember at all ever seeing this passage in the Bible. So that may be your situation as well. Even if you've done a through the New Testament or through the Bible reading, you may have never stopped and paid attention to this one. So, Acts chapter 20, verse 6. After the Passover ended, we boarded a ship to Philippi in Macedonia, and 5 days later joined them in Troas, where we stayed for a week. Now, this is Paul, who is a part of the we. The writer who is saying we is Luke. Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke, which is perhaps most famous for, in those days, Caesar Augustus sent out a decree that all the world should be taxed. The Advent story was written by Luke, and Luke also, this is his second volume, wrote the book of Acts. And Luke is a doctor by training. And so Luke and Paul and probably another few people are part of an entourage who are traveling. This is Paul's third missionary journey, and they are essentially on the way to Ephesus. Now, Passover has ended. They've boarded a ship. They're in Troas. They're essentially waiting in Troas for a week in order to board another ship to continue on. But quite an event happens there during their time in Troas. On the first day of the week, we gathered with the local believers to share in the Lord's Supper. So we're essentially kind of reading a journal entry here as Luke keeps one as he follows Paul. So they joined the local believers to share in the Lord's Supper. Paul was preaching to them, and since he was leaving the next day, he kept talking until midnight. So this is really an important passage for us to help us understand what's going on in the early church, because this passage is one of, if not the earliest indication to us that they're now meeting on the first day of the week. They're now meeting on Sunday, which could have been by Jewish reckoning either Saturday night around midnight they're meeting, or it could mean Sunday night around midnight they're meeting. But typically Sabbath and the early Christians would have met on Friday night. And so now we're seeing that the primary meeting together of Christians has now kind of moved to this Sunday, first day of the week time period, in honor of Christ's resurrection. So they're gathering. Interesting. Note what it says. They didn't gather for a church service. They didn't gather for a sermon. They didn't gather for worship. Notice what they gather here together for is the Lord's Supper. And so the primary point of the church's early gatherings was the Lord's Supper. Now, we have to remove, in a way, our perspective and viewpoint of what it means for the Lord's Supper, because when we hear the Lord's Supper, what we think of is a wafer or a little nasty chiclet piece of bread, or if you use real bread, or if you're a part of Christ's table, you might use pancakes or muffins or something else, but it's essentially a little piece of some sort of bread, and either a sip out of something that isn't even worth a shot glass. It's so small, of wine or grape juice, or maybe you don't even get that much. You don't even get a taste of it. You just, in tinction, you dip it in, dip the bread into the cup and just wet it a little bit. That's not the picture that we should have in mind here when we hear the Lord's Supper. Doing the Lord's Supper, communion, in that way came along much, much later. When they say the Lord's Supper, they truly mean the Lord's Supper. This was the best thing that I can use in order to help you understand what this was like. Is this was a potluck. So it could say the Lord's potluck. That's the image that you should have in mind whenever you hear or read Lord's Supper in Scripture. Now, it's likely, because we have from Paul in Corinthians the words that were used, so it is likely that they did, in fact, use the words, use the bread, use the words that go along with the wine, and use the wine and bless it and use it. But it would have been essentially a part of this larger thing called a supper. Specifically, they called them agape feasts. Agape is a Greek word for love, so they called them love feasts. And so they would gather together in love for each other and for God, and they would throw a feast, at which the Lord's Supper would have been perhaps central to, but certainly would have been a part of. And Paul preaching to them wasn't necessarily a requirement for the service. Singing, we don't even know if they sang. They may not have sung. They may have sung. Preaching may have been a part of it, may not have been a part of it, but here we know in this one it was the meal. It was the food. So they gather for that. But because Paul is in town and Paul was well known, Paul was important, Paul was deemed as being one of the primary apostles in the church, they allow him to preach. And since he's leaving the next day, he keeps talking until midnight. Now, church history tells us, and if you have the Bible study book that we sent as a part of the Whole50 Bible study, it indicates this. But if you didn't, I want to make sure you know. Church history kind of indicates that Paul was not a great preacher. This passage is a primary works-cited reference for that, as we're about to see. Paul wasn't known for being a phenomenal preacher. He was known for being smart as a whip, being very convincing, being very logical and analytical, being a very powerful and strong-willed force. Stubborn is another word for that. But the word on the street was that Paul's preaching was kind of boring, that he was kind of long-winded, and well, that this passage is going to give some credibility to. But he keeps going, and he keeps going, and he keeps going, and he kept talking even until midnight, and the service probably would have begun around sundown. So this has been going on a really long time, and people have been there a really long time. And so the upstairs room where they were meeting in was lit with many flickering lamps. Now, why this is pointed out could be a couple of things. One of the things that we know from history is that one of the accusations made against Christians was that they met in darkness in the middle of the night to do their rituals. And so it was like a slam that they didn't want anyone to see what they were doing. So maybe Dr. Luke points out the lamps in order to point out, no, we don't meet in darkness, we meet in light. The other reason Luke may have pointed out the lamps was because lamps produce smoke, lamps produce oxygen. The light from torches and from many flickering lamps is soothing. It can tend to put one to sleep. And so perhaps it was because Luke is pointing out that there was a reason why this next event is going to happen, and it wasn't just Paul's preaching that caused this series of events in order to happen. There were other data points. So maybe Dr. Luke is being kind here to Paul. As Paul spoke on and on, a young man whose name we have, which I couldn't find anything that I wondered if it was put in here because this boy actually ends up going on to do something or become something important. In my small amount of research, I couldn't find anything. But if you find something about that, post it in the comments, because I would love to know if there is any church history or any data on what might have become of Eutychus, because the fact that we have his name is very important. Now, it may well be that's because he became someone or something, or it may well be because he was an important or recognized figure even as a young man, even as a teenager, which is probably what that means. Now, not necessarily by our standards of teenager, but a teenager meaning somewhere in his teens, early teens, most likely. But he's sitting on the windowsill, probably in order to get some fresh air, or because the seat there was nice, and he becomes very drowsy, either from the lamps or from Paul's preaching or from both. Maybe it's the time of day too. Finally, he fell sound asleep and loses his balance on the perch and falls 3 stories to his death below. Now, there's been a lot of conjecture that he wasn't really dead, especially because in a moment, we're going to read Paul's reaction here. But we have to remember that the person who is writing this account is a doctor. Luke is a doctor by trade, not from a diploma mill, but is a doctor. And so we know that if Luke says he was dead, he was dead. Now, you may think, well, Luke is just kind of holding to the party line here because they wanted to see this as a miracle. Seems unlikely because there's actually another place in Luke where everybody thought that an individual had died and come back to life. And Luke kind of says, no, that's not really what happened there. So Luke, we know, would have said, yeah, he wasn't really dead, because Luke's already proven that he would do that in a different place. So we can have confidence that Eutychus died from that 3-story fall. And 3 stories, I can confirm, is enough to die from a fall. I've witnessed it. So this kid's dead. So Paul goes down, bends over him, took him into his arms, yells back at everybody who's kind of freaking out, wondering what's going on. Is he okay? And Paul says, don't worry, he's alive. Then they all go back upstairs. They share in the Lord's Supper, so they continue eating. And Paul continues talking with them until dawn. And then he left. Meanwhile, the young man was taken home alive and well, and everyone was greatly relieved. Now, he was dead, so he was raised from the dead. The text doesn't specifically tell us that Paul raised him from the dead. Obviously, we know that anyone who is reanimated, who's brought back to life, it's a miracle and a gift of God, even if it's through the hands of a human being. But Paul essentially is attributed this miracle of resurrection of this young boy whom Dr. Luke, who was on the scene, says clearly was dead. Now, I kind of love this, that Paul says, don't worry, he's alive. A lot of the commentators really spiritualize this and talk a lot about the worry here. What I notice is Paul's downplaying of the situation, which, if frankly my preaching had killed somebody, I'd probably kind of want to downplay the role that my preaching played in that as well. Don't worry about it, guys. He's alive. Had nothing at all to do with the sermon or the fact that I've been speaking for 4 hours and half the room's asleep. Let's all go back upstairs. Let's have some dinner. That dessert over there. Wow, Mrs. Smith, that pie, that looks to die for. I mean, yeah, it looks really good, Mrs. Smith. So thanks for let's all have some pie. And Paul can't help himself. He just keeps going. The text says until dawn. Sunset to sunrise, they're all there. Which, if it actually began on a Sunday rather than on Saturday night, they're all going to work the next day. Likely even on Sunday, they would have all gone back to work, because it all would have rotated around probably the Jewish time. And then Paul leaves. Meanwhile, and I'm kind of glad we get this epilogue. Meanwhile, Dr. Luke says, the young man was taken home alive and well, and everyone was greatly relieved. I think they were greatly relieved, obviously, because the kid didn't die and he was okay. I think they were probably greatly relieved that there wasn't a death attributed to this new Christian community. That would not have been great PR, especially for a group that's already being said of them that they're meeting in darkness and doing strange rituals. They're already under scrutiny. If they're not suffering in areas, they will be in this area soon. And so there should be some great relief that he's alive. But I'll tell you, maybe it's not that they're relieved that the boy is alive. Maybe they're just relieved that Paul's done preaching. Meanwhile, the young man was taken home alive and well. And meanwhile, everyone was greatly relieved that Paul had finished speaking and left and went home to go bore some other group of people. So this is just because I'm weird, one of my favorite stories and one of my favorite passages in Scripture. And what can we get out of this? Don't fall asleep in church. The moral of the story here is don't fall asleep during the sermon, or else. Actually, yeah, I don't agree with that. Usually pastors can see when you're asleep. Now, because we're mostly an online congregation, I can't. Fall asleep anytime you want. But I'll tell you that over the years in in-person gatherings and church services and preaching, whenever somebody would come up, and it happened more than you might think, would apologize for falling asleep or being sleepy, I'd say, you know what? Next time, go to sleep. I don't think that there is anything that would be more of a blessing to me than to have someone feel so at peace and so comfortable that they would simply fall asleep. To me, that is that's a gift, that you feel that peaceful in the pew or wherever you're sitting that you'd fall asleep. And I would guesstimate that you need that holy, sacred space of rest more than anything that you might think I have to say to hear. So sleep freely and without guilt, and there will be no judgment from me. Just don't sit in a windowsill on the third level where you might harm yourself if you fall over. So there might be some wisdom there. The other thing too that I think we can gain from this is God's always in control and paying attention. You know, there's some commentators who wrote even in the early church, there was, in their writings and reflections on this passage, there was a lot of struggle as to whether or not Eutychus fell asleep simply because he was tired, or because Eutychus fell asleep because he was spiritually dull, like he wasn't tuned in spiritually to what was going on, and so he just was disconnected, and so wasn't really paying attention. Maybe the kid who's goofing off in church, and so there's this real tension between commentators and scholars and the early church writers as to whether or not this should be taken at face value. The kid was just sleepy and fell asleep, or whether or not there's something deeper, a metaphor, something for what was going on spiritually with him. For me, I don't think that there's anything more here than the kid fell asleep. Dr. Luke tends to be a very straightforward writer and doesn't bury things in deep metaphors. This is a journal. But the flip side of that, I would say, is there could be some challenge here to us, even if Eutychus didn't have that challenge, as to whether or not we're kind of asleep at the wheel of our spiritual lives. You can be in all of the right places, doing all of the right things, going to church, putting in time, and it can just be you putting in time and be spiritually disconnected. And when that happens, we're certainly in danger of, when we're disconnected, falling asleep at the spiritual wheel of our lives and suffering a fall that could be harmful to us. And so while I think that may not be Eutychus's story, Though I didn't know him, it may well be. I do think that perhaps that could be our story as well. Did Luke include it in here for that reason, to challenge us in order to take a good hard look about whether we're awake or asleep at the wheel? John Eldridge talks a lot about that in his book, Waking the Dead, or they alive and alert, scale of 1 to 4. Did Luke include it in here for that? I don't know. But I think it can give us the privilege of looking at our own lives and saying, where are we? How are we? And make sure that we're fully awake for what's going on. Well, it's been great to have you here this morning. Again, you really only have a couple of more days here to take advantage of that. So if you want to be a part of our next study, you can, and you don't have to have this resource, but the resource will be a great help for you. And I'm also throwing in a few extra gifts. I've said one, but I've got all of this stuff like sitting right here on the desk next to me for us to put these boxes together. And I said boxes, so it's not just a book. There's going to be some stuff in this box, and it's going to be fun. So we'd love to have you be a part of receiving that and blessing you with it. But until tomorrow, happy reading.